The UN says more than 300 people have been killed and tens of thousands have been displaced from a refugee camp in Sudan's Darfur region after an attack by the paramilitary rebel group Rapid Support Forces. Today marks 2 years since the outbreak of civil war between the rival factions of the military-led government. Boswell is the International Crisis Group's project director for the Horn of Africa, and he joins us now from Doha. Alan, welcome to the program. Now, firstly, this horrific attack in Darfur, is this a response to the Sudanese army regaining control over the capital, Khartoum?
Well, it is a changing of the epicenter of the fighting because Khartoum had been the main, it's where the war broke out 2 years ago, and it was where the main battles were being fought. So now that battle's more or less been won by the Sudanese army, we have seen violence uptick in the Darfur region, although this overall battle has been going on for over a year.
Yes, and did that capture of Khartoum change the conflict in any way or form?
Yeah, well, this war is very unique in Sudanese history because it's the first war to really come to the capital, Khartoum, and it started in Khartoum. And because the capital itself has been a war zone and has been destroyed, it essentially has collapsed the Sudanese state. So I think the recapture of Khartoum has lessened concerns that the Sudanese state might be in might never be recovered, so to speak, and it's pushed the war into a new phase. But it hasn't ended the war on its own.
Yes, now it's been, it's considered the worst humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. There's been 30,000 over people killed, millions displaced. Now, what are the key challenges that are facing aid relief efforts to get into Sudan at the moment?
Well, aid workers and aid agencies have faced numerous obstacles to try to get food into the Sudanese. The UN has called it the worst one of the worst hunger crises in the modern era, is how they've described the situation facing millions of Sudanese. And we have had aid, basically food aid, piling up on the borders of Sudan, unable to get in. It's primarily because both sides of the war use what obstacles they can to block food aid into their opponent's territory. So we've seen lots of obstacles set up where essentially the UN is barred official entry from certain points into areas controlled by the RSF because the UN recognizes the Sudanese army as the official government. And then when they do get in, oftentimes they're looted. They're faced with exorbitant bribes. So aid access has been a really huge problem.
And do you think the situation has become worse because of the impacts of cuts to U.S. aid?
For sure, the cuts to U.S. aid, although there have been carve-outs for life-saving humanitarian relief in some instances, in effect, it meant that a lot of these, what were called soup kitchens in many urban areas like Khartoum, that were some of the last lifelines for Sudanese, most of those were U.S. funded, and those got shuttered. But then many of the actual NGOs that deliver the food aid on behalf of the UN or others, many of those were essentially under stop work orders or had to cut staff and were unable to deliver the food as well. So it's had a broad-based effect, and so much confusion took place because of how these cuts were executed too, that it's taken a long time for the industry to try to recover.
Alan, now London is currently hosting, as we speak, this conference, an international conference to address this crisis. Officials there are saying that these are talks aimed towards peace. But what are you expecting from these talks in London?
Well, I think aimed at peace is a good way of describing it. They have described it as trying to find a pathway to peace. That's a euphemism in a way for saying that there are no actual peace talks on the horizon, and this is an international conference in part designed to try to find some sort of consensus towards even going back to any international mediation. Sometimes Sudan is called the world's forgotten crisis. I'm not sure it's forgotten, but it's often ignored. And there basically has not been any serious peace initiative for quite some time. So the UK hopes by bringing all these different countries together at a high level that it can somehow kickstart more momentum towards peace talks in Sudan. But they face very large obstacles, and there's no guarantee there will be any breakthrough at this conference.
Yes, and as far as any efforts towards peace is concerned, have the leaders of both the Sudanese army and or the RSF, have they been receptive to being heard?
Well, the Sudanese army has largely rejected peace talks since the beginning of the conflict. They view the RSF as a rebel. They label it terrorist group, and they've said openly that they are not keen on any negotiations. They want to win the war militarily. So that stance has really obviously made any peace talks quite a challenge. Now, the Sudanese army has a number of outside backers who they rely on for military support. So I think the hope has been if you get enough of those involved in the peace process that they could essentially pressure the Sudanese army to come into talks.
Now, speaking of military support, now one nation that's been invited to this conference is in London is the UAE. It's been previously accused of secretly supplying weapons to paramilitary forces like the RSF. Firstly, Alan, is there any truth to this?
Yeah, well, so as I mentioned, there are numerous regional countries involved. On the Sudanese army, you have quite an array of countries who are backing it. On the RSF side, the UAE is widely seen as the main patron of that group. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that this is a regional war, a regionalized war that is continuing to escalating. Both sides are continuing to see large flows of new weapons. We have both sides receiving drones, counter drones. These are the sort of technologies that weren't really in Sudan when this war broke out. Both sides would have exhausted their weapons a long time ago if it wasn't for outside involvement in this conflict.
Yes, and as far as the UAE is concerned, what's their motive? What do they stand to gain by providing the RSF that military support?
Sure, and I should just say, Crisis Group doesn't investigate the arms transfers themselves, but there have been numerous reports to that effect. The UAE's backing of the RSF is largely stems from its years of engagement in Sudan. Its relationship with the RSF actually goes back to its campaign in Yemen. Both the Saudis and the Emiratis relied on RSF fighters, this paramilitary force from Sudan, relied on these fighters for as ground troops in their campaign in Yemen. And then both of those countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, then backed Sudan's military when it helped overthrow the Sudanese government over the dictator who had ruled for 30 years, and then they seized power themselves. Now, once this war broke out, where you had the two sides of the military fighting each other, the UAE basically ended up on the side of the RSF for a number of reasons, and unfortunately, we've seen just continued escalation rather than a pivot towards trying to repair all these relationships and end this war.
Okay, Alan Boswell, really good to have you give us your insights into such a disastrous crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.